Roy Boukidjian is System Director of Infection Prevention at Dignity Health in San Francisco. He has board certifications in infection control, public health, and he's a nurse executive with a master's in nursing leadership from California State Fullerton. He currently serves on the Hospital-Acquired Infection Work Group for Policy and Legislation, headed by the California Hospital Association and the California Department of Health. Roy has served as president of the Tri-Valley APIC chapter in California in 2014, and he is a hero of infection prevention. That initial award happened in 2013, and I understand his system is going to receive another award this evening. So congratulations. Them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Roy.
Can you guys hear me?
Echo? No? Yes? Yes? Okay, echo. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I know it's the last day, so thank you for being with us. There's really good information. Hopefully we could have an exchange. All right, so back in October of 2016, a roundtable of experts came together at ID Week, and Ruth and I were fortunate enough to be on that roundtable to discuss probe reprocessing challenges in general. And those proceedings were eventually published in Infection Control Today. So what did we talk about? Well, we talked about a couple things. We talked about adherence to guidelines, gaps in current guidelines, who's accountable for oversight and training for probe use and reprocessing. Is it the IP, really? Is it the radiology director? Who is it? How IPs can be prepared to respond to Joint Commission CMS. We discussed the survey of APIC members that was sent out a while ago, as well as the expansion of ultrasound probe procedures across the healthcare system. So not only to departments, but healthcare system in general, if there is a system, impact of that expansion on infection risk, centralized versus decentralized reprocessing, and of course, manual versus automated reprocessing. So there's a lot to cover. We also discussed the CDC alert that was published in 2015 that basically said healthcare facilities should review the cleaning, disinfection, and sterilization procedures of medical devices. In addition to that, the Joint Commission Safety Advisory back in 2014, based on 2013 data, identified 7 out of 13 immediate threat to life events due to HLD and sterilization. And I'm not sure if you guys saw last month's TJC Safety Advisory Alert. They mentioned the same thing last month. So it's definitely on their radar. In addition to that, there are other alerts out there, such as from the UK, where the alert identified a patient unfortunately passing away due to a Hep B infection, potentially due to a TEE procedure. That TEE probe was unfortunately not properly disinfected. So there are similar agencies, similar to the FDA, that released alerts across their country to indicate ultrasound disinfection practices should be reviewed. So current guidelines in the US. There are current guidelines in the US, believe it or not. Some are ultrasound specific, some are more general. They are harmonized in the recommendations, but it's hard to synthesize across all documents. The proliferation or the expansion of ultrasound throughout departments are not addressed, and I actually had a small conversation with some of my team members yesterday, and we're like, oh my God, we should take a look at this. And of course, the recent clinical research were not covered in those past guidelines. So guidelines exist today in addressing probe reprocessing. So some of those guidelines. So the American Institute of Ultrasound and Medicine and CDC in 2014 and 2008 respectively, they all came together and basically agreed that semi-critical and critical ultrasound probes must minimally undergo HLD, even if used with a probe cover. In addition to that, the FDA, AMI, Joint Commission, in relation to standards and regs, also agree that semi-critical reusable medical devices should undergo HLD. So you'll see this common theme as we go through this, that all these agencies or regulatory folks or even standards and guidelines, they all agree on the same principle, which is rare. It's rare. So in relation to a global aspect, again, there are guidelines out there that actually agree with US guidelines. Go figure, there is. There's guidelines from the UK, Ireland, Australia, the World Federation for Ultrasound in Medicine and Biology. They all agreed from the aspect of high-level disinfection of semi-critical ultrasound probes. Some of those guidelines include the Scottish, Irish, again, and then something very interesting, the Australian College of Infection Prevention and Control and the Australian Society of Ultrasound in Medicine actually came together and created a joint guideline in relation to this specifically, which is the first. So they all indicated that, again, semi-critical ultrasound probes, intracavity or surface, must undergo high-level disinfection even when we use a probe cover. So challenges in the US. Well, there's a couple challenges. One, again, variety of clinical staff doing the procedure. Who is it? Is it the PIC team? Is it the perioperative team? Is it the radiology team? Who is it? And of course, again, the variety of the procedures out there. So it is challenging to keep track. When I ask an IP, so, where are your ultrasound probes used? I'm like, well, we use it in radiology. We got a women's center, maybe oncology. And we don't think about it everywhere else. So it is very interesting to see where the knowledge gap is. So I would encourage everyone to ask yourself, where in my hospital are semi-critical ultrasound probes used? Seriously, where? And are we correctly classifying the procedure according to existing US guidelines? Is it a semi-critical procedure? Is it a critical procedure? And so on. So the Australian guideline actually assisted their country to identify what needs high-level disinfection and what doesn't. And one thing that's very interesting actually here that blew my mind, they actually classify PIC insertion and CVC insertion as requiring high-level disinfection. And when we think about it, like, okay, why is that? Because practically no one does that. And I asked my radiology director at one of our facilities, so what do you do? I mean, technically it's a sterile procedure. You technically drape the patient from head to toe. You're wearing sterile attire. Everything's sterile. But your probe is not. Now, your probe cover is, hopefully. And supposedly the process is you just wipe it down with a germicidal wipe. So it is very interesting to see how the practice is. And when we look at the guidelines and identify what procedures actually constitute a semi-critical procedure and critical, the thinking changes a little bit. So the table addresses the proliferation, actually, in multiple departments. So radiology, OB, vascular, cardiac. Also, again, oncology, they use them as well. And again, they all agree about high disinfection in these type of procedures. So some clinical updates I want to share with you. So the probe handle of our lovely ultrasound probe needs to be disinfected. Dr. Alpha in 2015 published an article that basically said that it is imperative that guidelines and healthcare policies are updated to ensure that vaginal ultrasound devices are handled as well as the probe handle or head are adequately cleaned and disinfected after every patient use. So there's a couple of studies that show over 80% of probe handles are a reservoir for pathogens, and that's why we want to high-level disinfect the handle itself. Not all probe handles can be immersed in liquid solution, as many of us know, and we know for a fact that there are technologies out there that actually do this type of procedure or process. So HPV. So this is not new, probably to none of you. HPV contamination in connection with high-level disinfection has been on the forefront of many articles, and that's basically what the slide is showing you, that there is information out there as far as HPV contamination. So obviously, there are multiple strains. They cause over 99% of cervical cancer. They are transmitted through sexual contact. Though, interestingly enough, there has been some studies to show non-sexual transmission. You ask, like, how is that possible? HPV infection in children, the study showed that it was actually transmitted in the prenatal phase, which was very interesting. And then 2 studies showed, one in a community center, one in a university hospital, in which HPV DNA were identified on fingertips of the infected individual. So again, some additional studies, 43.8% of scopes were contaminated with HPV in an OB clinic that was identified. 3 to 7% of ultrasound probes are contaminated with HPV DNA after reprocessing. And as we all know, HPV is resistant to disinfection, desiccation, and remains infectious on a dry environment for several days. So it is a problem. So some studies were published actually in basically comparing, you could say, high-level disinfection procedures for these probes. And it was clearly identified that an automated hydrogen peroxide device is effective against these native HPVs according to FDA requirements. So it is tested per FDA, which is the key here. You know, many folks say, well, you know, Roy, it's not only about the disinfection. It's about the entire process. You know, the cleaning, the transportation, the high-level disinfection, the handling, the storage, et cetera. And I get it. That's very true. However, if you just compare solution itself, we know for a fact that OPA does not kill HPV, and hydrogen peroxide in an automated system does. That's the takeaway. All right, so we talked about what type of procedures could be semi-critical or critical. Well, here's plenty. Ultrasound-guided biopsy, ultrasound-guided central venous access, abdominal paracentesis, intravascular procedures, thoracentesis, et cetera. So you can see there's a lot of procedures out there that ultrasound probes are used in which we as IPs and professionals would want to know and identify whether we're actually processing our ultrasound probes correctly. So when I first looked at the right side and saw all these departments, it's, you know, departments in which procedures is carried out. Instead of reading all that, it's just everywhere. That's the answer. It's everywhere. Okay. So again, in 2008, actually CDC also produced some guidelines, and surface probes used in sterile procedures must undergo HLD. So the question to you all in this particular picture is, you know, is a sterile probe cover used? Is that a sterile rubber band? I've never seen a sterile rubber band. Is anybody? I don't know. Seriously. Is a sterile single-use gel used? And if the probe has minimally undergone high-level disinfection. So something to think about. Oh, this is fun. So when I saw this, the European Society of Radiology produced a survey back in 2015. So when I first saw it, I'm sitting down on the screen right in front of me. I looked at it, then I looked back. Then I looked at it, then I looked back. I'm like, no. So then I call my wife. I'm like, Beth, come here, sit here. What does that say? And she's like, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, what? Really? Okay, thank you, goodbye. Then I pick up my 15-month-old daughter, put her in my lap. I'm like, what does that say? And she's like, blah, 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 blah. Okay, I'm like, okay, you're done. Thank you very much. But it's a very interesting survey. So the European Society of Radiology conducted a survey. 900 plus radiologists responded. 97% were radiologists, 946 total respondents. So obviously you can see the mass majority were radiologists. And I looked at surface and endocavity probe disinfection practice. Here's the kicker. Oh no, actually it's the other side. Okay, a little bit more data. So 26 or 2.7% were aware of cases of HAI transmission through ultrasound procedures, which is interesting. It's like, well, okay, that's very interesting. And they identified in the survey that the procedures that they believed caused that transmission included breast biopsy, joint aspiration, transvaginal ultrasound, and transrectal biopsy, which is very interesting. And the presumed transmitted organisms, MRSA, Staph aureus, CMV, HPV, and fungal infection. Here's the kicker. So the endocavity ultrasound probe reprocessing pie over there, if you look at it, it said, the survey said 69%, they wiped off the gel first, and then they just wiped it with a germicidal wipe. And this is an endocavity procedure. I love the 9%. It says wiping off the gel first, and then they wipe it off at the end of the day. So it's like procedure, oh, and then I wipe it. Very bad. And in relation to interventional procedures as well, the results weren't good. So it was truly a shocker when I read that. That's why, I called my wife. I called my daughter. I'm like, please help me read this because I speak no English. So it is definitely an eye-opener. So on-the-ground observations. One ultrasound probe can be used in different capacities. Probe can be used for both gallbladder evaluation as well as paracentesis. And this is actually some conversations I had with my radiology director at one of those facilities, that do not assume one device is only used for one thing. It's used for multiple things. Radiology department is not responsible for all ultrasound probes. That particular director said, you know, I just manage probes here, but I don't know what they're doing at the Women's Center. I don't know what they're doing in oncology, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a big problem. Facilities assume that a sterile cover is sufficient during sterile procedures and no HLD is required. And of course, ultrasound gel use differs from facility to facility or even department to department. You talk to the radiology department, they say, oh yeah, we use single-use sterile gel packs. I'm like, oh, good job. And then you go to the OB department or the Women's Center. Oh, you know, we just refill the bottle. I'm like, well, come on. I mean, you're in the same facility. You're literally 3 minutes away from each other. Get it together. So as far as automation is concerned, as we all know, endoscopy automation has been a lifesaver when we're processing endoscopes, okay? It reduces human error, improves standardization of practice, simplifies the workflow, and eliminates the handling of specific chemicals, or if you need a fume hood, and if you have the right air exchanges above that, et cetera. And same thing with ultrasound. So new technology is available that would allow us to reap the benefits similar to the benefits of your automated endoscope reprocessor. And it permits safe processing in procedure rooms at point of care, and that's what we'll touch base on a little bit. So reason for point of care. Well, a couple reasons. One, we know that ultrasound probes are everywhere, so centralization is very hard. It avoids mixing up scopes during transportation or storage. It avoids probe damage during transportation. And of course, the sheer volume of ultrasounds you need in a hospital could increase significantly if things aren't where they are for immediate access by the clinician. So the barriers, well, some barriers some would think of is safety first. You know, is the chemical safe to utilize in that point of care area? The cross-contamination of clean devices depending on what your process is in that point of care location. And of course, the notion of centralized reprocessing allows for better control. And from a high-level aspect, yeah, it does. And that's why a lot of people centralize endoscope reprocessing with sterile processing, et cetera. But when you have a proliferation of ultrasound probes everywhere, centralization practically probably will not work. So point of care is possible, it's beneficial. Technologies do allow it. The enclosed systems that are available now and the probe storage covers prevent that cross-contamination. And of course, again, easy handling and convenience. I always tell this to folks that ask me about a product. What do you think about this product? And it might be the best product in the world. But the answer is, if it's not convenient, it doesn't matter how good your product is. It's not going to be purchased. It's not going to be used. That's your primary piece of information. So if it's convenient for staff to use, regardless of how great it is, that's your golden nugget. So key takeaways. So again, guidelines and practice and standards do exist today. So please utilize those guidelines if you haven't seen them before. Again, remember to ask yourself, where in your hospital are semi-critical ultrasound probes used? Are they correctly being classified? And who's classifying them? Like literally who? The frontline staff? Is it the department leader? Who is it? Look at local policies that should address reprocessing endocavity and surface probe that are used in these particular conditions. Look at sterile probe covers. Again, sterile single-use ultrasound gel during these procedures. And identify an accountable source. Hopefully, it's not an IP accountable source, but an accountable source for these procedures. And with that, I'll hand it to Ruth. All right.